And thanks everybody for the invitation. I was a little embarrassed when Amy remembered what the last DIMACS workshop was that she was at, because I was here and I can't remember it. I was so happy when you looked at a 2003 slide and couldn't quite remember something. It made me feel a little better. So anyway, talk about imperfect recall in any case. But I was really excited to get the invitation. The topic of this workshop is something that's kind of near and dear to my heart. The idea of bringing together game theory, especially mechanism design, machine learning, has been something that's been top of mind for me off and on for many years. And very recently, it's been very much on for me in some of the work that we've been doing at Google within my team on recommender ecosystems. And what I want to talk about is some of my thinking around recommender ecosystems. For almost all of my career, I've really focused on AI techniques that will help users make better decisions, or in other words, thinking about AI systems that can act in a user's best interest. And you might ask, well, what does, and I'll focus on recommender systems today, which you could argue are probably one of the most impactful uses of AI when it comes to making or influencing the decisions made by people over the globe. You know, they're impacting the lives of billions of people on a daily basis. You might ask, what does that have to do with multi-party decision making or economic modeling or game theory? Well, I want to try to convince you that that recommender systems are really ecosystems that have a lot of actors and agents whose behaviors are being correlated by the recommendations that are being made. And if we ignore how we're tying together their behaviors, if we ignore their incentives, if we don't model the multi-agent or economic interactions, I don't think we're going to be able to build recommender systems that actually act in a user's best interest. And I want to try to convince you of that today. And of course, that will lead us to an area that I think has largely been untapped within recommender systems, that is mechanism design, which for me is about preference revelation, information sharing, and so on, which I think we need a lot more of in recommender systems. So I'm just going to kick things off with a kind of a little cartoonish view of how recommender systems work, right? So at least the typical recommender systems right now, I would argue they're myopic, but myopic in two senses. First of all, when we have its user sitting here, they've got a particular context, maybe they issue a query. A recommender system, generally speaking, will try out of the corpus of available items or content, will try to predict the best immediate match for that user in the moment. Without worrying about, hey, what other recommendations might follow and how this might be good or bad for the user. A lot of people, including myself, folks on my team, a lot of folks at Google and all over the place, have been looking at these types of problems, bringing techniques like reinforcement learning, sequence modeling, and so on to improve what our recommenders are able to do. But I would argue that's still very much in its infancy, and a lot more work is needed. But I want to focus on a different sense in which recommenders are myopic, in the sense that they're really quite local. When a recommendation is made for this user by a typical recommender system, there is no thought given to how this recommendation might impact other users, our ability to serve users in the future, other participants in the system, such as content providers, item vendors, et cetera, et cetera. So, this is problematic because, or maybe it's not problematic, maybe everything's fine. Is this off or on? Try one more time.
Do you want to try mine?
Yeah, maybe. Thanks. Is this USB here? Okay. I tested it sitting at the table and it worked. Heck. Oops. Okay. Oops. Where's the on button, Amy?
It's on off on the side of toggle.
Toggle. Oh, there we go. Got it. Yay, okay. Oh, good. There is a problem to talk about. Okay. All right, and now this is a problem because, like I think we all know this, recommender systems actually lie at the heart of very complex ecosystems. We've got millions or billions of users, the providers or creators of content. We've got vendors of items, as Muthu was talking about earlier this morning. Even the platform itself, or even competing platforms, are actors or agents in this ecosystem. And each one of them has their own incentives for interacting, for participating in this ecosystem, for interacting with the recommender. And it's those incentives that are going to drive their behaviors, how they respond to what the recommender system does. And the interactions of these can actually cause some very interesting dynamics to emerge over time. I won't get into a lot of details, but if you're familiar with a lot of the work that goes on in fairness modeling within machine learning these days, you could argue that a lot of that arises only because of the interactions of multiple different groups of users with the recommender. Rich get richer phenomena, filter bubbles, things along those lines. And I want to try to convince you that if you ignore these things, it can have a dramatic and negative impact on our ability to serve users well. I'm going to do this. This is going to be a fairly high-level talk, only a tiny bit of technical stuff. Happy to have this be very discussion-oriented, so please, please interrupt. So I'm just going to illustrate this with a very simple cartoonish picture, okay? So a lot of recommenders will work, at least in part, by taking users and the items that are being recommended, embedding them in some latent space. For instance, if you're recommending content, articles, news, what have you, video, music, you might embed all of the users represented in these gray circles, and maybe the content of a couple of providers, a red provider and a blue provider, in some latent topic space, for example. And here, the affinity that a user has for the content of any one of these providers is inversely proportional to the distance, right? So the closer you are to the provider, the more affinity you have with their content. So what will happen to if you're a myopic or local recommender? Obviously, when any one of these users shows up and issues a query, you're going to recommend the content of the closest provider because that's what's best for that user, okay? And I'm not even going to worry about kind of long-term effective individual items on the users. But we have to remember all of these actors in the system have incentives, right? And let's imagine, just for the sake of argument, that the blue provider and the red provider both require a certain degree of engagement. Suppose they each need at least 6 users to be satisfied. Otherwise, they're going to say, why am I bothering making this content available on the recommender system, okay? So what's going to happen, the blue provider is going to say, hey, this is not worth my time. They pick up their toys, they go home, and the blue content disappears. So at the next point in time, the recommender has no choice but to recommend the red content to these users who much preferred the blue content, right? So what's gone on is we've driven this dynamical system where the dynamics is just due to creator behavior into a very nasty equilibrium, right? That's the simplest kind of dynamical system, right? And this blue community, I'll call them the niche community just because it's a little smaller than the red community, they're now much worse off in this equilibrium, okay? But of course there's something different that the recommender could have done, which I'm sure you can all see. It could, for example, have said, well, I'm going to take these 2 red users that are almost indifferent between the red content and the blue content, and I'm going to recommend the blue content to them, right? That's enough to keep the blue provider happy, drive the system into an equilibrium that increases overall social welfare, at least from the user's perspective, okay? Obviously, the red provider's a little worse off. And in particular, we've got these 2 red users that are, they're paying a small price. They're almost indifferent between these 2 bits of content, but they are paying a small price in order to sustain this, let's call it maybe a fairer, or it's certainly an equilibrium that generates higher social welfare for the users themselves, okay? All right, so that's the basic idea here. Now, one question is, oops, you know what, I'm going to skip, there are little videos of how our little algorithms work. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, okay? So one question you might ask is, well, how do you get a recommender to do this? Well, the first thing you have to recognize is we can't think about users in isolation. We can't just look at them locally and say, hey, we're going to match you to the content that you most want at this moment, right? Because it may not serve that user's interests over the long term or the interests of the ecosystem over the long term, right? So, the way to think about this is kind of as a matching problem, right? So we're going to formulate this, again, a little more holistically as a matching optimization, where the idea is we're going to have some idea of the distribution of users and their queries and their contexts that will arrive over time. We want to match these queries or users to the content providers as they arrive, but we want to do so in a way that anticipates that entire distribution. And we want to maximize overall, here I'm just focusing on user social welfare. I'll talk about how wrinkles we can make in this. But we want to maximize user social welfare over a long horizon, in fact, over an infinite horizon perhaps, okay? Assuming that these users issue, related queries over and over again. But we have to do so in a way that accounts for the viability of these providers, right? So each one of these is going to have their own threshold for deciding when to stay and so on. And if they don't get enough engagement, then over time they're just going to start to walk away, okay? So what we're aiming for then is basically a socially optimal equilibrium of this dynamical system where creators can come and go, all right? And this is some work that we did just a couple of years ago. I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail here, but I want to use it for a springboard for some bigger picture questions. Yeah?
So maybe we'll be addressing this later, but what about fairness of the user? Because in the example that you presented before, all the cost of maintaining the social web.
Yeah. So for example, you say, hey, these two guys are bearing, it's not much of a cost, but they're bearing all of the costs. And of course, generally speaking, you might do some stochastic matching and share the pain a little bit. I'll talk about in realistic systems. In fact, even doing this over the long run is actually good for, I would argue, for all of these users, because users are not static. Their preferences change. And I like to say we want to keep, let's call it genetic diversity in the ecosystem, which is generally better for everybody, right? But I don't have precise answers to those questions, but they're really important ones, okay? And we'll talk about those. Yeah.
So you can imagine in this particular example, you can even imagine if rather than having these binary decisions from the providers of these, if they could just shift a little bit the type of content they're creating, you can imagine that this would solve this problem. I imagine higher dimensions.
Hold on to that thought. Bring that question up again, because we'll get exactly to that point, okay? Right? This is a very simple, this is the most simple non-strategic behavior you can imagine. Just leave the system. And we need to generalize that. Thomas, yeah.
So there seems to be some sort of like grandfathering in the story so far, that if you were in the system, you have some sort of right to stay in the system and it's good for everybody to keep you in. But if you think about entry, if you favor people just for being content creators, there's a huge payment you get just for being there. So is there entry also, or is it just about exit avoidance?
In this case? Yeah, right. I'm going to give you just a very stylized picture, assuming that, hey, there's a fixed set of content creators and we're trying to keep them around. The real system, you think about any real recommender system, providers are coming and going and they're changing what they're doing, and we'll get into those types of questions. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Feel free.
The providers are going away, as you are pointing out. Potentially, is there any incentive mechanism which can be built to make sure that they remain there?
That's why we're going to talk a little bit about mechanism design. No, these are exactly the questions, right? You guys are like 2 years ahead of me, right? So, all right. So that's the ultimate goal, okay? So, I will say you can actually formulate this problem as a giant reinforcement learning problem. I think probably some people in this room, Amy, for example, have worked on things like multi-agent reinforcement learning. And we've actually done some work. We've looked at this as from that perspective, but it's this huge, massive state space. You have to worry about the state of satisfaction of each user, of each content provider, and so on. I'll just give one slide on the matching optimization. Basically, what this is trying to do is anticipate the equilibrium that a proper RL system would drive the system into anyway, and it makes things much more, at least conceptually, tractable. All right. So I'm not going to go into the details. You can kind of think of this whole problem as it's kind of like a facility location problem, right? Here are these content creators. They're in fixed locations. I've got to decide which ones to open and which ones to let go in order to maximize user social welfare, right? Basically how we do it is we formulate it as a mixed integer program. We basically have a single decision epoch where we're drawing users or user queries from some known distribution. We do this optimal matching in a way that in expectation is going to, if a provider is matched, if a user is matched to any content provider, then you have to make sure you've matched enough users to that content provider. So opening that facility was worth the cost, okay? And then anybody who didn't get matched, they just walk away, right? So what'll happen is you'll solve this one stage decision problem. You'll immediately end up in an equilibrium where any content provider that is viable at the end of that stage will be viable forever. And the optimization objective is basically going to maximize social welfare. So we're going to get an average, an infinite horizon average utility, socially optimal matching. Okay. To solve this thing, we basically say we're just going to solve it using LP rounding. There is a submodular formulation of this problem where you kind of add creators one at a time. LP rounding just kicks the crap out of submodularity, even though it has no guarantees, both in terms of computational performance, but just the actual quality of the matching is much, much higher. Okay. I think more interesting is just to kind of get a feel for the types of results that arise when you generate these types of matchings. Yes, Henry.
I want to clarify on the dynamic versus single epoch thing. So you're solving at a single epoch in order to ensure dynamic stability. Is that the idea, or are the dynamics in the mill?
No, so no dynamics in the mill. Okay, so think of it this way, right? Content creators, it takes some time, providers, takes them some time to decide, hey, did I get enough engagement, right? So stylistically, we're just gonna call that a decision epoch, right? And there are gonna be users that come and go, and then we're gonna do that matching, and then at the end of that period, each one of these providers is gonna make a decision, do I stay or do I go, okay? And the utility for the utility that we generate for users, because they're actually drawing queries from a distribution drawn from their interests, we're actually going to measure their utility not just by summing up. We can have nonlinear utility based on the affinity of the things that we match to them.
And what's the stochasticity? Is it users within the epoch?
Yes. So users, there is stochasticity with respect to the user, right? So it's a distribution. User shows up with certain probability. They issue a query from that, say, that embedding space with a certain probability and so on. Okay? All right. But then the creator behavior right now, you could make that stochastic as well. In this simple model, they just walk away. All right? Okay. Okay. So here, I just want to give you a flavor for what's going on. So we've done some work with real-world user preferences, but these are actually just synthetic results where we randomly draw user preferences. I think this is a 50-dimensional embedding space, and there are two versions of this. One is where these preferences or their user interests, their position in topic space is kind of uniformly distributed, and in this case we see that the LP rounding scheme to solve the matching optimization does a much better job, generates much higher average user utility. Less negative is good, right? Your maximum utility is 0 because we're looking at distances. Then just a myopic or local approach. And you can see that, of course, it's actually maintaining a greater number of content providers as viable, right? So it's going to keep more of them alive, okay? But interestingly, if you have preferences that are drawn from a slightly more realistic distribution, user preferences tend to be clustered in communities a little bit. We see actually a much greater difference in the average utility per user. And notice that we're actually not keeping providers around just to keep them around, right? That's not part of the objective. It's just in service of increasing user social welfare, right? So in this case, you actually end up, on average, fewer providers actually stick around, okay? Finally, probably the most interesting view of this is you look, for instance, look at a single run and you look at the distribution of user utility generated by the myopic approach versus the matching approach. What you see here, the myopic approach, the histogram of user utilities is in green. For the matching approach, it's in purple. And what you see is that utility is shifted dramatically to the right. We've got this nice little bump. Notice the y-axis here is on a log scale. We've got this nice little bump of users that are much better off under the matching optimization. But you are paying a small price here, right? The users that are best off under the myopic approach, they're paying a small cost to support this much greater, this equilibrium that has much higher social welfare, okay? And you might argue that this is a fairer way, right? Fairer is a loaded term, right? Some people are paying the cost, okay? Just a couple of quick remarks, and then I want to talk about mechanism design and some of the research challenges. One thing I like about this way of thinking about the optimization problem is it's very easy to add constraints to this MIP. Okay, somebody's asking. Oh, I think you were asking, Shigev, about the who's bearing the cost, right? Well, we saw those two users who were bearing the cost relative to the myopic matching. You might say, hey, it's okay if some users bear a little bit of cost, but I don't want it to be overwhelming, so I might want to put a cap on the regret that any user might incur relative to the myopic approach, right? Nobody should pay too much of a cost in order to support this equilibrium. We can add group fairness constraints. If we're worried about content provider utility, fairness to the providers, things along those lines. Very easy to incorporate these types of things in your objective or in your constraints, okay? I'll skip some of this stuff. You can actually do things with for instance, sigmoidal utility for users and so on, but I won't get into that, okay? But I want to kind of wrap up by talking about the 10? Oh, good, okay. Just want to talk about some of the bigger picture questions around this type of thinking around recommender ecosystems, okay? That was an incredibly simple and stylized model, right? Very unrealistic, okay? What we really need are models that have capture more realistic user behaviors, richer forms of utility or preferences, richer forms of context, right? User preferences are actually very context dependent, and often they appear to be transient. We have to worry about the dynamics of user behavior. The content provider behaviors, which I think you were asking about, right? We had very limited action space, and they were acting very non-strategically, of just staying or going, right? There's nothing game theoretic about that, right? We have to think about the space of all possible actions, behaviors that they might take. What are their incentives? What information do they have at their disposal to make good decisions, all right? Then we have to worry about what the recommender system knows about these things. We want this recommender system to do some good optimization relative to whatever objective it has. We'll come back and talk about that. But that has to be done relative to the knowledge that it has about how these agents are going to act. Okay, and then we have to define the RS objective. I think Amy, you brought that up with Muthu's talk this morning. So. I'll talk a little bit about that, okay? So the minute you throw all of those considerations into the mix, to me, it immediately says, hey, this is a market or mechanism design problem, right? And I think, that's an area that's been, again, largely untapped within the recommender systems community, but I think it actually can bring a lot of substantial benefits, but at the same time, I don't think we can take mechanism design out of the box and apply it to such real world situations that are embodied in complex recommender systems. That's unfortunate from, if you're trying to build good recommender systems. It's fortunate for people like us who want to solve the research problems, all right? So let me talk about just a couple of these things and I'll wrap up. But feel free to interject, ask questions as we go through this, okay? So one of the nice things I like about mechanism design for this type of problem is that it forces you to articulate a social welfare function or a social choice function, right? This is critical if we want to maximize user benefit, keep the ecosystem healthy, and so on. And in particular, it will force us, those of us who deploy recommender systems, to explicitly articulate when we look at these equilibria, which are more or less desirable. Right now, we just, we build algorithms, they go out and they do their thing, and we're not really directing it because we're not worried about these interactions. We're really focused locally and myopically on the individual users, okay? That's a bit of an overstatement, but we certainly don't view it from a mechanism design optimization, holistic optimization perspective, okay? So I think that's one of the main benefits of taking a mechanism design approach, but there are going to be huge challenges, right? What is the social choice function? That doesn't solve the problem. It just gives you a framework for thinking about the problem, okay? And what we're really going to need are tools so that we can assess the various trade-offs among the multiple criteria that we want to embody in our systems. And I'll start to talk about some of these things, okay? why is this going to be hard? Why can't you take mechanism design out of the box, right? Well, first of all, the preference space that we're talking about is incredibly complex, right? It's hard enough dealing with multi-attribute preferences and combinatorial auctions and things like this. With users, we're talking about consumption streams, like I'm consuming a bunch of news content or music or buying sequences of products, putting together vacation packages, what have you, right? What is the utility that we're generating for a user? What well-being, what satisfaction do they get from an extended consumption stream, right? We don't have good models of that. Even if we did, optimizing for that is going to be incredibly complicated, okay? Furthermore, the outcomes that we're generating for users are often dynamically constructed. We don't know what we're aiming for. You're building a vacation package. You're not going to outline think about all of the possible things that you could do, the places you could visit, and so on. These outcomes are being constructed on the fly. And then, preferences, user preferences. Did I touch something? No, okay. User preferences, right? We often think in mechanism design, well, here are the set of outcomes, the utility functions in the user's head, we've got to extract it. Of course, that's not the way real users work. From a behavioral perspective, they're often constructing their preferences while they're interacting with the recommender system. And there's no doubt that the recommender system is helping to shape these preferences, right? So, how do you do mechanism design in a setting like that? Okay. The other thing about mechanism design, we think about it from the perspective of preference revelation because of the complexity of these outcome spaces. User preferences are never going to be directly revealed. We're not going to say, tell me your utility function, right? Now, some may be, we do a lot of work in conversational recommender systems where you might ask, oh, what are you in the mood for? Do you like this attribute of this type of item, et cetera, right? But that's not where most of our information about user preferences comes from. It comes from observing their behavior. So that means, because of the size, preference revelation is going to be partial and incremental, right? But because we're using ML to generalize from the behavior of some users to predict the preferences of others, things are going to be very noisy, especially, because of whatever biases are present in our ML generalization. Even when we're asking questions, users are going to give incorrect responses, misinterpret what we're asking them, et cetera, et cetera. I won't go into it, but it's obvious that we're going to get a very biased view of user preferences. It's going to be very costly to acquire these preferences. All of these things, when we talk about applying mechanism design in the real world with a big R, right? These are going to be really challenging problems, okay? Lots of areas of AI and behavioral economics come to bear here. And then the final thing I want to just briefly mention is the fact that we're dealing with boundedly rational actors in this system, right? In mechanism design, we usually think of actors as being rational in two senses. One, they're trying to optimize their own utility, perhaps over an extended horizon. And two, they're strategic. They're anticipating the actions of other agents, maybe anticipating the equilibrium that they're going to end up in. Users, for most recommender systems, there are exceptions, are unlikely to be rational in either one of these senses, right? They may do a partial job at optimizing their own long-term utility, but they're cognitively limited, prey to the normal cognitive biases and heuristics. And what they do will not necessarily reveal what's best for them, okay? Moreover, users are almost never strategic. Very small counterexamples to this, right? They're not thinking about how are they influence the recommendations that I'm going to get next, or what providers are going to. There's some exceptions, especially in small communities, for instance, music communities, but by and large, they're not very strategic. Content providers, vendors of items, products and services, they're probably going to be more strategic than users, right? But the thing is, we actually don't provide them with very good tools in terms of the ability to optimize what they're doing. And they don't have very much information in order to make good decisions. 2 minutes, great. All right. So I'm going to conclude with just a really simple example, which is actually related to something Muthu talked about this morning, just briefly. Okay, right? What tools can we put in the hands? What information can we make available to, say, content providers in our example, so that they can make good decisions that will improve the social welfare, the health of the entire ecosystem, and what incentives can we offer for them to make such decisions? Okay. So I want to illustrate, won't go through a lot of details. Actually, this is some work with Thomas Sid. One of Thomas's students did an internship with us this summer and was working on this problem. I'm just going to give you a flavor of the problem, not of the solution. Okay, and this pertains to this idea of information asymmetry in recommender systems, right? And this is what mechanism design should help us resolve. Okay, so in our cartoonish example, a content provider uploads some content, they don't get very much engagement, right? If they didn't get enough, our cartoonish scenario said, hey, they're just going to walk away, take their toys and go home, right? But there are many other things that they can do, right? They can change the frequency, increase or decrease the frequency with which they create new content, change the quality, engage in spam or clickbaity practices, or, to your point, they might actually change the content that they produce. Okay? That would be a good thing to do. The problem is they have very little insight, generally speaking, into the causes of low engagement, right? So you've got this red provider over here not getting much engagement. Why, right? Is it because there's no audience, nobody wants the content that they're producing or making available? Is there a large audience for this content, but they're in a very competitive space, so there are hundreds of other content providers producing basically the same thing? Is there an audience, but the quality of the content they're producing is just too low? They don't really know. Generally speaking, content providers have only a very limited view based on the interactions with the users engaging with them as to what's going on. They do not have this holistic view of, hey, what do users around the world really want? What are other content providers offering, right? But the recommender system actually has much greater visibility, right? So now the question is, what could a recommender system do? What information could they put in the hands of content providers so that when they respond appropriately, we're improving overall social welfare? Okay. Now we have to be careful. You can't just say, hey, here's the preferences of all users. Here's what other content providers are doing. You have to worry about privacy and things of that nature. Okay. So one thing we've been looking at, and I'm gonna leave it at this, and I'll let you grind away in your imagination how you might think about these problems, is thinking about what we're calling advice or content nudges, right? So suppose we were in a situation, let me go back here, in a situation like this where, hey, the red provider and the blue provider are doing a pretty good job, but there are these green users over here that aren't getting good recommendations at all, right? Suppose we knew something about the abilities of these content providers, right? The types of content they could generate or make available, the way they could change what they're currently doing, and kind of nudge them, right? Get this blue provider, hey, why don't you start to do stuff over here? Why don't you do red provider, you go here, and the whole system is going to be much better off, right? What information can we give them? What incentives can we put in front of them to get them to make these changes? It involves all kinds of questions around, hey, what skills do they have? What can they do? It's like when Muthu was talking about, hey, can vendors generate new products based on what they know about the audience or the customer? If we're talking about incentives and suggesting new things, how much do they trust what the recommender system is suggesting? How do we incentivize them to take that risk and try to produce something new? There's some very complicated dynamics that comes in here and so on, right? So David, I'll stop there. Let me skip that and leave it there, all right? But happy to engage in any discussion, take any questions.
Great, thank you. Great, we have a few minutes for questions. Yes.
Yes. So we talked about very complex mechanism and the design problem.
Yep.
So what kind of approaches do you have in mind to deal with such complex?
For this is for all of you guys to help me solve, right? This is for the research community, right? So for example, when we think about, say, these content provider nudges, for example, right? It's very, we talked about facility location, but it's almost analogous to like multi-robot path planning, right? We're trying to move content creators through space. You know, it would be great from a facility location point of view if you could take every content provider, lift them up, put them wherever you wanted, right? And then say, hey, there, now go do this, right? There are some real challenges with doing that, right? Because, you know, people are already doing certain things, so we've got to kind of nudge them along the way. There were super interesting questions around, like, you know, how do I talked about this in terms of like points in embedding space, right? I can't say to a content provider, hey, you know, here's a point in my 512 dimensional embedding space, go generate some content that lands there, right? So we've got, you know, we're working on ways to actually make those things actionable using interpretable models, using generative models, things along those lines. There's a lot of really challenging questions. This is going to keep me working for the rest of my career, I think. So anyway, Alex, yeah.
You might be interested to have a look in formal design theory. So how designers conceive and design new products or new policies or new services. It's one of the ideas that are inside that is extracting new attributes that represent, that describe an object, no? Observing which ones are hidden. Until today, let's say, not separable, with respect to how decisions are taken against choosing a certain object or not. And this is how designers empirically construct new objects which until today do not exist.
That's right.
Because this is what a designer is expected to do.
That's right.
In formal design theory, there are some interesting approaches on how this can be formalized and how it can be related to decision theory. Because it tends to be a decision problem to a larger extent. So it would be interesting to follow a little bit these people what are doing.
Right.
So I could give you some references.
But I think I know the type of work that you're thinking about, and I think you and I think the same about a lot of these things. And in fact, you know, one way to think about this is that, hey, the recommender system, you know, if each one of these dots corresponds to the preferences of any particular user, right? And suppose that these models are perfect in the sense that, you know, they'll generalize to unseen parts of the space, then you can think of the models of users and user queries as kind of ideal market research. We kind of know, hey, if you generated a new product up here, right, we know what the demand would be, right? Now the question about kind of the design, like what does it mean to be a product up here from the perspective of, hey, here's an arbitrary point in embedding space. You have to translate that into, you know, something concrete. Hey, this is a content item that has particular attributes, or it's a product that has these features, and so on. And I think there's a pretty strong connection there, for sure.
There is a challenge obviously here, that if you are thinking about this, this is based on the rebuild preferences. I'm assuming this is based on rebuild preferences.
Based on which?
Rebuild preferences. So for that reason, you may not have even observations in those areas which you can actually recommend from that angle. So that's not completely clear. You might have million-dimensional thing, but it won't work unless you have something different.
Absolutely, right? So just to be clear, when we say, hey, here's a point here, here's a product, we know there's some demand, right? We don't know that for sure, right? That's assuming that this machine learned model is actually perfectly able to generalize outside of the corpus of items on which it was trained. Absolutely, right? But it's a good starting point for making suggestions. Doesn't mean we're actually going to go do that. You have to, you have to do, hey, we do a little bit, some user studies, we do a little market research, or you try a little bit A/B experimentation and move in that direction ever so slightly. But absolutely, right? There's no magic bullet There's no magic bullet here. But I think it's a useful conceptual device for thinking about how we might expand the boundaries. But you're absolutely right. Oh, last question. Okay. Oh, sorry. Oh, I pointed in your direction, so I'll be fair. I'll be fair. Yeah.
So
No, I pointed in your direction. So, but I'll come talk to you after. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. I'd like to pose kind of a challenging question. Feel free to put this later. But it is an inevitable byproduct that recommender systems nudge people's preferences, say on YouTube, based on the content that they watch.
So that's why I talked about preference construction and so on.
Yeah.
Let me simply say that may or may not be true.
Okay.
Right? But to the extent that it is true, that's why I talked about preference construction and influence and shaping people's preferences. And people's preferences are clearly dynamic, right? Without a doubt. But we don't understand the dynamics. So, people have written papers about this. We're very, my team focuses on long-term user satisfaction, well-being, and so on. So we're very concerned about these things. But I'll be honest, we do not have the models, right? I don't think we have good enough behavioral models for understanding how these things actually influence user preferences. But we need them. We absolutely need them. Yeah. So, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig.